Thank you so much. Thank you, Shanji. Good afternoon, everyone. Such a pleasure to join you today in person. Um, PRI is very much the original premier organization driving sustainable investment, responsible investment, and it does so to fulfill this mission, to move from commitment to action. And all of you are part of that story. But the great headwind we face today in the world isn't just one thematic, say climate. I understand you've been talking so much about climate. My software company is entirely focused on the financial impact of climate change. But we have to embed each theme, whether it is human rights, whether it is poverty, whether it is climate, into a broader global picture. And this being the final day of the event, this is a good opportunity to step back and take stock of that complex future that we are heading into and what that means for this agenda of responsible investment. So I already used this big word, complexity, a word that we use all the time. I'm not going to dive entirely scientifically into what it means, but I'm going to focus on how we got there. Because when we say the world is complex, we mean it's uncertain, it's unpredictable, we don't know what direction things are going. But why is that? How did it come to be that way? And the way I like to explain it is through something very, very tangible: geography. Or rather, as I like to point out, geographies. We don't often use that word in the plural, but we should, because there are layers of geography in the world. Now, when someone says geography, you often just think of natural geography, physical geography, the globe, nature. And there, we don't really have a whole lot of dispute as to what the map looks like. We have blue for water, we have brown for deserts, we have green for forests, and so forth. And we've tended to take that for granted. But even there, just to mention climate change briefly, of course, things are changing, right? We have rising sea levels, we have desertification, we have so many dynamics, instability, you might say, that have been unleashed in the natural world, that static map, that globe, is actually changing. And not even just imperceptibly and subtly, quite noticeably in many places. Then on top of that, you have another layer of geography, right? Political geography. This is the map that hangs in most offices and walls and classrooms around the world. And again, we tend to take it as sort of frozen, as is. Sometimes people are quite offended, of course, when the map changes, especially if the lines have shifted and encroached on their territory. But as we see around the world today, there are conflicts, and there always have been and perhaps always will be. New countries are being born. Some countries, sadly, are erased, and so forth. So this map, too, is changing, and this is one layer on top of that. And then we have the functional geography, economic geography, infrastructure, supply chains, urbanization, all of those things, the built environment that we, through our own volition, have topographically engineered, is the technical term, on top of the world. And we treat these as three separate things. And of course, there's a fourth layer, which I'm going to show you shortly, which is human geography, right? The geography of people, the geography of us. If you want to understand why the world is so complicated today or so complex, it's actually because the dynamics between these four layers are getting ever more unpredictable. And these layers are not entirely aligned. The geography of people, the geography of resources, the geography of infrastructure, the geography of borders, and so forth, are very often misaligned. And the more connected the world becomes, a world that is so hyper-connected today, is a world in which the feedback loops among locations and layers of geography become that much more rapid and unpredictable in their outcomes. So we got to where we are, this hyper-complex, unpredictable world, because we built it. We have been building it to be this way, and it appears sometimes to be spinning out of our control through these rapid feedback loops. So complexity is a reality. It's not something that we are successfully unwinding, may not even want to. And that presents a challenge when we think about what kind of world, what kind of future we're investing in. Geopolitics is almost symptomatic of this too. Gone are the days where it was a simple unipolar diagram of the world in which one flag the American flag sat at the center, and everyone else was secondary. Now we're increasingly in a world where there isn't really one geopolitical center of power. You'll note that I haven't replaced at the center of this spider web any one flag. I haven't put China there, I haven't put the European Union there, I haven't put Russia there. No one is there. Instead, we also live, much like that map of functional geography, in a world that is a network, a marketplace, what I call the geopolitical marketplace, in which you have every region of the world connected to every other region of the world and engaging in free association, you might say, across those geographies, forging their own relations, making their own decisions, with no one power able to fully block and dominate as a hegemon would in previous eras. Instead, in this marketplace, you have an open competition of supply and demand, of resource providers, technology providers, capital providers, and receivers. And that too creates a whole lot of complexity. So one week you're hearing about attempts at sanctions of one country and those that are on board with them and those that are not. You hear about new alliances and coalitions of countries like BRICS and BRICS plus 6 and so forth. All of that, again, diplomatic complexity is a result of a framework that's not simple and rigid, but that's distributed, diffuse, many, many nodes, all connected to each other, many feedback loops. So that broader principle of geography applies certainly in geopolitics as well. Now I mentioned human geography, another layer where we've tended to take certain things for granted. We've not taken for granted the staggering rise of the world population. I think many people appreciate and are aware that in the past 100 years, from 1920 till 2020 and to the present, in 2022, the United Nations announced that the world population had reached 8 billion people. So we've quadrupled from 2 billion to 8 billion people in a century. But again, in the moment, we tend to believe that people are where they belong, that we've naturally divided ourselves into these discrete national territories based upon ethnic affiliations and so forth. And that really betrays the actual reality of a world that's been shaped for many, many millennia by very, very large-scale migrations. But again, here we have it, 8 billion people. Every human being is a pixel, actually, on this map. Everyone in this room, all of us, we are a pixel on this map. And so this becomes the fourth layer of geography that has to interact with, dynamically, with the functional geography, the political geography, and the natural geography. And as I said before, these layers are not naturally aligned today. They're not well aligned. They're not optimized. And the best example to demonstrate why that's so problematic is climate change. If you look at this, all you see is human beings as pixels on the terrestrial formations of the world. What you don't see is what's happening with the rapid advance of climate change, but I'm going to show you that now. This is called the suitability index. What it looks at is the relative change in the livability of a location as global temperatures rise. As you well know, we're set to exceed the 1.5 degree target, perhaps over 2 degrees. That's average surface temperature rise. In some places, it's already exceeded that. And a red zone doesn't mean a place that's utterly unlivable, though indeed many of the places already are, but it's certainly decreasingly so. And very often when we see a map like this, you'll see it in scientific journals, sometimes reported in multilateral organizations making forecasts about what's going to happen. They give you this picture of something that might happen by 2050. But if you're familiar and you're looking even just at headline news, you'll often see just extract a certain rectangle or square from this. Take, for example, South Asia. As you know, in the seasonal heat waves that strike India and Pakistan, temperatures can sometimes reach almost 50 degrees Celsius. And you'll see exactly this today, right? It's not a forecast of 2050. In many ways, it's already happened. Now, let's layer the geographies for a minute. You have 3 or 4 countries in South Asia. At the same time that the United Nations announced that the world population had reached 8 billion people, they also pointed out that India's population now exceeds that of China. If you take Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh together, you have about 1.75, 1.8 billion people, the largest concentration of human beings anywhere on the planet, right? About a fifth of the human population in a zone that is almost entirely red on this map. Now, I didn't make this map, let's be clear. This is the scientific consensus about the trajectory of global temperature rise. If ever there was a case, if ever there was a single image that captures the staggering misalignment in the geography of where people are, where resources are, where borders are, and where economic activity and supply chains are, it would be this one. It would be this. This is the most perverse, ironic, dangerous, worrying map that I could show you. Because what you see not only again is that so much of the world population is trapped at the moment in these areas that are increasingly red. The profound irony is that the areas that are green are becoming greener, more livable on a relative basis to their historical livability based upon this suitability index. These are the regions that have the aging populations that are even depopulating. So talk about misalignment. We've got the majority of the world's young people, the demographic future of our species, in places that are becoming less and less livable, and the places that scientists say are going to be more habitable and survivable have fewer and fewer people. And then we have the borders on top of that that create obviously an enormous friction on human mobility. That's just one of the many ironies that is embedded in this image. And we have the COP28 summit coming up in a month in Dubai. We've had 27 summits by my count prior to that. Have they resolved this situation? Are the net zero targets, decarbonization targets, the Paris green emissions goals, even if we met those tomorrow, ask yourself, have we solved this? Is that going to be enough? It's not. So responsible investing really does have to look at the big picture, right? Not just one thing. And I wanted to make that clear through some of these images. Now, we are mammals, right? And all mammals are endowed with a basic instinct, fight or flight, right? And I don't normally advocate picking a fight with nature. You don't usually win. And so, as we have done for hundreds of thousands of years, I can well imagine a gradual, or perhaps not so gradual, relocation, resettlement of the world population in light of just some of the trends that I've shared with you. And as you may have noticed from that map of human geography earlier, most of the world's population, again, is in Asia. South Asia alone, as I mentioned, about 1.8 billion people. All of Asia together, this rectangle, about 4.6, 4.7 billion people. So most of humanity lives on this map. We're here on this map right now. Wherever you've come from, welcome to the zone of the world that not only has most of the present human population, but most of the future human population as well. I'm going to come back in just a moment to the demographics, but what happens here, therefore, may have a disproportionate impact, of course, on the world economy, right, and on the health, the welfare, and other dynamics, geopolitical and otherwise, of the world. In any case, Eurasia, more broadly, including Europe off to the west here, is the largest landmass in the world, alone contains 2/3 of the human population and some of the largest economic regions as well. What I've also superimposed on top of the geography is all of these crisscrossing lines that you see, and that points to some of the infrastructure development, the functional geography. So here you have the political geography and the natural geography and the functional geography. And some people would call this, the Belt and Road map. But in reality, the process of building a more infrastructurally connected Eurasia, what some people might call the Silk Roads as well, has existed for many, many centuries and has really been resurrected over the past 30 years. China has played a major role. Japan has played a very significant role in financing this infrastructure. Europe has too. And now there is, going back to the geopolitical slide, a huge effort from Europe, from the United States as well, to participate in the process of connecting Eurasia internally to itself in many ways, to unlock some landlocked territories, to enable greater flows of goods. And there's going to be population movement and mobility on top of that as well. And I'll give you some scenarios. So now we have to bring in the climate layer again. And I'm purposely sort of shuffling between these layers of geography, sometimes picking one or two or three at a time to give you a sense of how they interrelate to each other, because again, that is what makes the world so complex. So now here we are, that pristine map of Asia I showed you before, where you didn't see the human geography, but you did see this emerging pattern of infrastructural connectivity, which on paper sounds great, and it's going to be very necessary, maybe in ways, and to enable mobility in ways we've not foreseen. Why? Well, because of the climate factor again, which I left out of the last one. Well, this is a cartogram. A cartogram takes data and inflates, geographical coordinates to tell a story in a way. And what this cartogram is telling you is right there in the headline. The rise of Asia, this stratospheric, incredible story of post-World War II in particular, and post-colonial modernization, industrialization, economic growth, population growth. What that has done has made Asia also the center now of global greenhouse gas emissions and resource consumption, and that has accelerated climate change, which of course means that sea levels are rising and Asian populations are exposed to flooding, more typhoons, hurricanes, droughts, heat waves, all of those climate perils. So the rise of Asia, which we think of it in a positive economic light, is also accelerating the sinking of Asia, which is the negative climate externality, as it were. And this is an example of a feedback loop. It's a really big feedback loop, not one that one pays attention to every single day, but it's very, very real. And so for those of us who live in Asia, who are operating, we're investing in Asia, we need to understand these dynamics, because it will shape where and how we invest into the future. So the future we're talking a lot about geography, which is the where, and I've talked a bit about the who in terms of the number of people and where they are. Now let's talk about the future of that human geography, a topic that should really obsess all of us who are, again, wanting to make responsible investments in humanity for the future. Because everyone in this room is living through a very novel moment in human history, one that no one alive can remember, not even, I'll make a local joke, it's meant out of great respect, but even the oldest Japanese person, since Japanese people are known for longevity, can remember a time when the world population was not growing like this, because as I said before, it has been for 100 years, right? So, but now that's not happening anymore, right? We are reaching what demographers call peak humanity. And everyone in this room may well live to see that day within just 20 to 30 years, when we actually reach the maximum human population. Now, there are many countries, of course, on a national basis, that already feel like they are at peak humanity. And this is also one of them, right? Populations that are in a state of indigenous decline because of subreplacement fertility levels. And so absent immigration, they would actually be in numerical decline. And the world as a whole, therefore, or many countries in the world, feel like they've reached peak humanity before the world reaches peak humanity. But either way, we're getting there much faster than we thought. It was only 25 years ago when demographers and economists at the World Bank or the United Nations would forecast that the world population might still reach 13 billion, 14 billion people. That got revised down to 12 billion, 11 billion. More recently, the Gates Foundation and others have put it at maybe 10, 10.5. But some of those studies were done just before COVID. Now, COVID, of course, we associate with many things, primarily the Great Lockdown, right, and many other, economic and other consequences. But from a demographic standpoint, it's the baby bust, and it's the biggest baby bust the world has experienced in quite a long time. And we're still experiencing and will continue to live through the knock-on effects of the COVID baby bust, meaning the very, very sudden, sharp drop in fertility in the years 2020, 2021, 2022, and again onwards. And what that means is that not only will the peak world population occur again, sooner than we thought, but we'll probably top out at a lower number than we thought. Perhaps not even 10 billion, perhaps 9.5 billion people. Again, we'll find out. We'll know when we get there. But the bottom line is we're going to get there a lot sooner at a much lower number than we thought, and many places feel like that already. Now, that has really significant consequences because, again, we've lived in a world where every generation that we can remember gave rise to a larger generation than itself. That's what happened. Greatest generation, the baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z are today's teens, and Gen Alpha. Gen Alpha are today's toddlers and babies, and they're not yet fully born until 2025. So in 2026, just a couple of years from now, we can come back and we'll know exactly how many Gen Alpha children there are in the world. And because of COVID, we now have two lines around that. We would have thought that much as keeping with the historical pattern, Gen Alpha will be larger than Gen Z. Every generation is larger than the one before. I don't think that's what's going to happen, right? Gen Alpha is probably going to be smaller than Gen Z. So if you have a Gen Z kid, right, a teen or something, that generation, that's the largest generational cohort our species has ever produced and ever will produce. And it's just going to get smaller and smaller and smaller from there. Now, that doesn't mean that humankind is disappearing, right? As it happens, youth collectively, and again, I say this consciously in Japan because it's an aging country, and when we talk about demographics globally, we very often focus on aging, partially because we're the ones doing the talking and we're obsessed with our own longevity, right, and our elongated life expectancy. But we forget that as a matter of statistical fact, most of the human population is young. The largest generations alive are millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha. They total about more than 5 billion people. So most of the world is young, not old. And if you want to be making investments in the future, investing for the future, you need to be looking at the characteristics, the attributes, the livelihoods of today's young people who, whether it is millennials, Gen Z, or Gen Alpha, they are, as I say here, just want to go back to this point, they're the present, they're the majority of the present, they're also the majority of the future, because elderly generations naturally pass on, and young people, by virtue of today's young people, by virtue of having fewer children or no children at all, they still dominate the demographic stack. So I call it it's almost science fiction when I say these words in bold, but the present is also the future. Because the present, the generation that dominates the present will also dominate the future. So the present and the future almost are the same people, even as they get older. No one alive today has encountered that concept, right? It hasn't happened. It's happening right now, though. So it matters a lot. Understanding young people matters a lot. Now, I used to be young. I used to think of myself as young. But to be faithful to a good, research methodology, when I've been writing my most recent book, I traveled a lot around the world and conducted a lot of focus groups and just went out on the street and spent a lot of time with actual young people, including in schools and my children's schools and so forth. And I really wanted to understand how young people think. And I see a lot of people in the audience my own age or maybe young, boomers and so forth. And we perhaps have had the luxury of growing up in developed societies and advanced economies. And we have a certain conception of what a normal person should be and how a normal person thinks and what their lifestyles are and what they aspire to, right? And we've earned that. But that doesn't mean that it really captures the predicament of young people. And I would sum it up in this way. Because we, again speaking, let's say, or maybe our parents' generation, think of normal as a 2-income household, living in a suburban place, owning a home, having 2 children, and all of those kind of accoutrements. But if you were to take the 8 billion people in the world today and line them up and take the median or the mode person, right? Would you describe them in that way? Would that be an accurate characterization of that person's life? It would be really, 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 really far from it, right? And these are the people that I'm writing about, the people I'm spending my time traveling and researching, because guess what? They're the future and we're not, right? And so the future is these people. And what are they? Well, if I had to sum it up in just a couple of bullet points, they're young, not old. They're single, they're not married. They don't have children. They don't own homes. They're financially struggling. They don't live in a Western OECD country. They live in the developing world, probably in a mega city. That's your median human being in the world today. So whatever you're doing, whatever profession, when you're thinking about the future, investing in the future and trying to improve humanity, remember that's your target audience, right? It's not me. It's not even necessarily the person on the other side of the table in a negotiation, right? If you want to invest in the future of humanity, do something for them. They're the ones, right? And that's the rump of humanity. Well, how they think, that may seem depressing, but how they think and their attitudes do inspire me. Because I think their values, their hearts are in the right place. And this is an area where you can actually summarize about billions of people, because since they're young and they all have mobile phones, we have proxies for what they think. Because we've never been able to spy on billions of people better than we can right now, especially young people. Because we have all their Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok metadata, right? And we survey, we poke and we prod, and we interview and whatnot, to no end. And so all the research, all the surveys, all the analysis, all the metadata actually paints a really clear picture of a group of, again, 4 or 5 billion people whose values can actually be summarized in 3 words that I find very plausible and admirable. Connectivity. The connectivity is a human right. They primarily mean digital connectivity by that, of course. Sustainability. One of the key themes we're here to talk about as well, right? A right to a sustainable ecosystem, planet, future. And mobility. By that, they certainly also mean physical mobility, to be where they want to be, go where they want to go, not be restricted. Many of them, of course, don't have the means to actualize those rights, but those are their aspirations, right? And I think, again, that is a valid and healthy response to the predicament that they are in, to the lives that they lead. And it's something that we have to perhaps honor and help them to fulfill, if possible. And what they're in search of course, is opportunity, right? Wherever they can find it. But I just want to point to, again, the drivers. I mentioned the political geography, the natural geography, the functional geography. When I look at today's young people and where they are versus the challenges, the geographical challenges, the economic challenges they face, and I look at what the drivers of their mobility are, right, or what the drivers of our mobility have been historically, right? Never have these drivers been more acute than today. Over the 100,000-year span of history, demographic imbalances, particularly in the 20th century, the gap between old and young, that's just what demographic imbalances are. Never have we lived in a world where the gap between old and young people was so vast as it is within countries. Just think about China, for example, the 1-2-4 age structure, right? Or 1-2-4, right? And even in Western societies too. So labor shortages. That was a huge driver of migration in the 20th century and has never been more, again, present or prominent than it is today. Political upheaval. Well, the number of countries that are the origin of 1 million displaced people, refugees, asylum seekers. Think of Syria, think of Ukraine and other conflicts around the world. There's at least a half dozen of them right now. At any given time, you have, there are moments that have been much more calm, let's say, than this moment. And I don't necessarily see an end in sight to our political violence either. Economic dislocation. Well, this is happening as a result of patterns of industrialization, deglobalization, or deindustrialization, I should say, when industrial operations, factories close in some place, people lose their jobs and are forced to move. Technological disruption isn't always a negative. It can also be positive. Think about COVID and remote work. A lot of people in the services economy can now live and be mobile and be wherever they want to be, digital nomads and so forth. And then climate change. Take a look at all of these. And if you think back to 2020, which is actually when I made this little slide, I thought to myself, my goodness, we're in the midst of a great lockdown. My publisher was actually kind of snickering and saying, this is kind of a bad time to write a book about the future of human geography when we're experiencing the greatest lockdown in human history and there's no end to it in sight. But I stuck to my guns simply because I said, well, have we ever lived in a time when the principal 5 drivers of human migration have been more acute than today? At some point, right? The lid's going to be lifted off of COVID and the lockdowns. And sure enough, if you look at 2022 data already in 2022, well, I should go back to 2019. 2019, right on the eve of COVID, we had recorded a year in which we had the largest volume of net international migration in human history. More than 1 billion people across borders. We'd reached a high point of international resettlement as well, about 275 million people living outside of their country of origin. And then it all stopped. But by 2022, it was above 2019 again. And 2023 will be even more. I think it tells you something really deep about humanity, about the human species, about human nature. To move is human, I like to say, and to move in response to whatever the stimulus is. As I said, fight or flight, right? And so the more need there is to fight, or the more desire there is to flee, the more you will have that result. And you multiply that by the functional geography, the connectivity I showed you earlier, motive and opportunity, let's say, right? The motive is certainly there among all those young people and how they think. And the opportunity is there in a connected world, not a borderless world, but a connected world. And the result is accelerated mobility. Now, let me bring it back to the human geography of this geography of Asia, which is, again, young people. So we're reaching peak humanity. There's only going to be 9.5, 10 billion people in the world. Most of the people are already in Asia. Well, it also logically follows, if you look at fertility rates, that most of the future youth population that I've been focusing on is also Asian youth. So the future of humanity, if you wanted to answer it really tangibly, materially, concretely, not just ethereally and philosophically, you could actually say the future of the human species is Asian youth. That is literally a true statement, right? And it becomes more and more and more true every single year. And so where Asian youth go and how Asian youth live is actually going to be a huge part of our collective future. And you can see right here just one little snapshot, because this is just the working age millennial population, which is just one slice of one generation, right? It's so staggeringly larger in this region of the world, even with the aging of Japan and China, than it is in the entire rest of the world. So I think that is something to keep an eye on. So where are youth going to go and where are Asian youth going to go in light of the political and the environmental stimuli? That's the question. And put it together with the fight or flight instinct, I think that you can make certain predictive models in a way. This is what I spend my time on, is saying, well, if you treat the 9 billion people of the world and run a giant agent-based model, a big simulation, what would it show about this future? Press play on this algorithm. What you'd find is, of course, naturally people will move from coastal areas to inland areas, from low-lying areas to more elevated areas, from hotter areas to cooler areas, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, where wars break out, there'll be a mass exodus from those places as well. And you will have a world that isn't necessarily nomadic, but a world in which there are definitely new patterns of settlement. And already we live in a world where, again, it's hard to disentangle, but this is what some people try to do. Well, what drivers or in terms of the mobile population of the world, what share of it originates or is driven by economic causes versus political causes versus climate? Well, here it's, let's say roughly a third, but we know very much from Darfur to Syria to elsewhere, these causes are all interlinked, right? It's never just one thing. People may leave a country because of political violence, but they're in search of economic opportunity. The environmental stress could be a cause of the political decay that leads people to want to leave. But suffice it to say that the yellow slice of this pie was zero in previous centuries, right? It rounded to zero, and already it's a lot more. And so if we thought that a world in which you had just tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people living outside of their country of origin was a high number, in this century, I'm sure it'll exceed 1 billion, right? I'm very, very, very sure of it. When we're very early into this century, I have a far, far higher chance of being right than wrong, given where the patterns are already. So imagine that world. Because again, I'll just go back to a demographic point really quickly. In our heads, especially if you're middle-aged, you're thinking, why would I want to move? I'm so settled, I'm so stable. Well, again, don't think that way, because that's not the way how young people think. We, quote unquote, think that way because we may be married, we may have 2 children, we may own a home, right? And this is how we think you can even look back and make an analogy, a conservative analogy to Vietnam War era generation. This is Western analogy, but where they were also radical. 1968, revolutionary movement, social upheaval, right? And they stabilize and settle down. But the conditions that make people want to just be sedentary, right? Like being married, owning a home, having a job, having a mortgage. Well, if today's young people aren't married and don't have children, don't own homes, and aren't happy in their circumstances, why would they act like you or me? Well, the answer is they're not. They're not going to, right? So we're going to have an ever more mobile world. And the familiar patterns of mass, interregional, planetary scale migration that we've gotten used to in the last couple of decades are going to alter. Now, it's already been a very, 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 very large number, to be clear, right? Tens of millions of people who have already relocated from Latin America into North America, circulation within Africa, South Asian populations in the Gulf, people within the former Soviet republics, by the way. You notice that that's the largest number on this chart. One of the largest flow or circulation of people within any given region of the world has actually just been in the last 30 years as the borders constantly get adjusted and ethnic groups shift within the former Soviet Union. What we're seeing happening right now between Russia and Ukraine is a horrific episode, but it's actually a symptom of something that's actually the resorting of that map, that political map that didn't just get settled overnight in 1991, right? So these things play out over decadal timescales. And what I'm saying that if you layer the political geography and tensions on top of this, and of course the climate stress map on top of this, and the underlying demographics being so concentrated in Asia and climate-stressed areas, is it so hard to imagine that you're going to have new arrows pointing in new directions, that you're going to have actually vectors of migration, the likes of which we've actually never seen, which is to say that large numbers of Asians relocating from Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, potentially further north, right, and further west as well, towards Europe, along these new Silk Roads that I showed you on that connected map. Put all these layers together and you can make a very plausible simulation about what's going to be novel and different, perhaps terrifying, but also an opportunity to do good in the future. So I'm not sure exactly what scenario is going to unfold. I make scenarios. I don't get to dictate the future. But a good scenario or set of scenarios posits a range of potential outcomes that may occur. But the important thing about building scenarios is that they should not only each be plausible and realistic. In order to do so, they actually have to have some seed of truth in the present. The trend has to already be visible today and you're extrapolating from it. And not only that, they shouldn't be entirely mutually exclusive, because everything that you're reading on this slide is actually already happening in some part of the world or the other, or often all at the same time in the same region of the world. Look closely, regional fortresses, places like North America or Europe that say, we like our lives such as they are. We want to wall ourselves in. We want to limit migration, right? We're going to prevent boats from crossing the Mediterranean Sea and try to prevent migrants from crossing the Rio Grande between Mexico and the United States. You also have what I call the new Middle Ages, right? Small scale, what I call islands of stability, in a way, places that are trying to just stabilize their own population, resource base, economies, but it leads to a very fractured world, if you will. And as you see, I've organized these axes according to more or less sustainability and higher and lower degree of migration. There's only one of these 4 scenarios that feels like something that is constructive, positive, where we act with foresight and reverse engineer our behavior to maximize, in a way, in a utilitarian way, the benefit to today's population of the world, what I call the Northern Lights scenario. And I don't mean only the Northern Hemisphere, but as you saw on the map, most of the places that suffer the least at a minimum from accelerating climate change tend to be in the Northern Hemisphere. You have to ask yourself, are we actually doing those things? Are we acting in that way? And that's, in a way, the final couple of points I want to make and the lessons that I hope that we can share. to point the way into the future. The first is this: migration is here to stay, right? And it's only going to expand, as I mentioned. From if you look back over the centuries, the last 3, 4, 5 centuries, from single-digit millions, double-digit millions, triple-digit millions into the billions, the decimal point has been moving to the right every single century. And there's no reason to believe right now, looking at the drivers, that it's going to stop. So this is a global trend. Accept it, that it's inevitable. View it as an opportunity, not just a challenge. Why? Well, because the world population is about to start declining. What is the future of your country? I say this now almost unconsciously in Japan, right? What is the future of a country, whether it's Japan or Russia or Italy or anywhere, without people, without a demographic plan? In geopolitics and geopolitical theory, which originates in the 19th century, demographics, the demographic base, was considered one of the principal elements of national power. In the 20th century, we kind of took it for granted because the world population was growing so much. We said, well, every country has lots of people, lots of young men to throw at combat or workers for factories. Well, that is going to stop happening. It has stopped happening. So remember that collecting people is collecting power. View migration as an opportunity. I believe that there is already underway, and there will be ever more, an all-out war for young talent. Countries will be begging young people to come and live inside their borders. Otherwise, you don't have a tax base, you don't have workers, you don't have nurses, caregivers, trash collectors, entrepreneurs, none of those things. And robots don't do all of that yet or anytime soon, not even in Japan. And so making that something, because you've talked about rights in this event during this conference, there are efforts, very nation efforts, because migration is the area that is the hardest perhaps to regulate and to have an international global consensus on. We can set parameters and rules around greenhouse gas emissions targets and collaborate in so many functions and spheres of the world economy. But part of the essence of national sovereignty is control over your borders against the movement of people. And it's the one aspect of sovereignty that no country will ever really truly give up, right? If you're from the United Kingdom and the United States, I think you know this very well. Certainly Japan too. If you recall how many layers of QR codes you needed just to get to your baggage at the airport here in Japan, you know this, right? No country's ever going to give that up. But there are ways that we can sponsor and support efforts that allow for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And this is necessary, and this becomes an asset because, again, thinking of young people not as a burden, but as a driver, right, of the economic future that we want to have, means that we can actually think of investing in upskilling them and giving them the roles and functions in our economies that we need them to play. So there's global skills partnerships that we see emerging bilaterally and regionally. So I want to distill it all down. I started with complexity, but complexity is something that's pretty hard to take home and to act on. So if I had to summarize everything and make it actionable and boil it down to just one or two things to remember, to take away, that can hopefully guide what you do every single day. The first is the meta point around untangling this complexity, and I call that reprogramming our geography, right? Our geographies, as I said at the beginning, are misaligned. And the COP process and no international summit is going to fix that misalignment, the misalignment of where the borders are, where the resources are, where the infrastructure is, where the people are. That's up to us, right? There is no master plan. There is no one supranational organization that's going to do it. We have to reprogram that geography. Well, how are we going to do it? What's the most humane way to do it? What's the responsible way to do it? And I would say you can do one of two things. Two paths to progress, as I say. You either move people to the geographies that have resources, again, where people are needed, where there's work, where there's capital, right, where their skills can be leveraged, or you move technologies to people, and that can be genetically modified seeds, that can be water desalination, it can be anything that makes a place continuously habitable, productive, and still a constructive part of the global division of labor. If I had to boil it down to just two things, I would say you either move people to resources or technologies to people. That's responsible investing. And that's what I hope all of you are doing already. I think as a member of PRI, you surely are. But I hope that that motivates you for what you do next into the future, because it is a very, very long road ahead. Thank you very much. Thank you.